Good morning, everyone. MSOM 602, Lesson 5 review, Lesson 6 preview, coming from Seattle today. Get to be home for a week before heading back out tomorrow. I just wanted to recap a little bit on Lesson 5. Lesson 5 was actually one of my favorite lessons in this 7-week series, and the reason being is because it really begins to make the shift. It makes the shift from talking about some of the principles of servant leadership to talking about the acts of servant leadership. And that's really the key here, because if all we do in servant leadership and the servant leadership discussion is sit around and have a discussion and we really don't go out and do anything, then it's really kind of a useless exercise. And so a couple of things that you really focused on this week. One, in the discussion board, you talked about a leadership point of view. And again, I had a student actually send me something this week. It was a great question, because they were talking about how do we move from the I in servant leadership to the we, which is really what it's about. And to me, part of that has to do with developing this leadership point of view. You have to be able to understand those things that are important to you. And in this class, it's really a progression. What I'm trying to do is to get you all to begin to think about those things that are important to you, those things that you value, and to begin to introduce some servant leadership principles, the 10 Spears servant leadership traits, so that now you have that foundation so that you can do what Alan Lurie talked about in the case study, go forth. And that's the key message in that case study, is do something with the servant leadership principles that you're learning. So go forth and move forward in those areas. Now, when Lurie talked about going forth in that article and in that story and his address to the rabbis, he was talking about a personal journey, but the personal journey was not a relocation. It was more of a spiritual shift. And so if you think about going forth in what you're doing and some of the areas that you have, my goal or my hope for you is that you'll take some of these principles and then not only just go forth from a personal perspective, but make it a spiritual shift in the way that you approach leadership now and in the future. And so that's really an important concept. And then in the memo exercise, one of the things I always like to talk about in this third memo exercise, because you had the what is servant leadership in the first memo exercise, you had why are we doing this from a company perspective in the second one. This one's really the one where the rubber hits the road. It's like, what's in it for me? And as an old salesperson, I used to always talk to salespeople that says, no one's going to buy the service that you're offering, the product that you're selling, or the idea that you're bringing up unless you establish a need. And so establishing a need is an incredibly important tool. And my hope is that in the third memo exercise, where it's what's in it for me or what's in it for the employee, that you've done a really good job in the communication to them about establishing the need to be able to put servant leadership into practice, not just from a company perspective, but from a personal perspective as well. And so those are the key elements of Lesson 5. It's kind of amazing. We finished 5 lessons and there are always 2 left. And I get to this point and I think that the time has just flown by. And if I talk to the students, sometimes they go, well, it hasn't flown by as much for me. But it has for me in those areas. And the key thing here is let's make that pivot from let's just quit talking about the servant leadership components of it now, and let's begin to put some of those things into action. So that's lesson 5. Coming up in Lesson 6, you have 2 discussion boards this time and a case study. The first discussion board talks about leaders as exemplars or as examples. There's some really big watch-outs here, though, and I hope you talk about these as you put your discussions together, because many times there are leaders who we end up placing too much faith and too much trust in, and they let you down. I mean, that happens in the world, it happens in politics, it happens in churches, and you can use example after example after example of that. So while it's good to have leaders who you follow and leaders who you read, understanding that the whole leader as exemplar or example perspective is not foolproof in those areas. So that's discussion 1. Discussion 2 is something I've always wanted to write a course on the topic here of situational leadership. Because as we begin to talk about, and as we have talked about leadership principles, one of the key things, and actually Ken Blanchard wrote a book on situational leadership that I think is really, really good, is leadership changes basis the situation. So basis the situation that you're in, basis the people that you're talking to. If you're talking to somebody who has skills in one area, maybe not in another, depending on where you are, maybe you're in a vocational perspective, or you're in a church perspective, or different things. And so the principles can't be just broadly and blanketly, is that a word? Be applied across a blanket. You have to look at the situation. And so we'll talk a little bit about situational leadership this week. And what I would encourage you to do, there will be a ton of writing on this in outside sources. So I would encourage you to make sure on this particular discussion that you use outside sources on situational leadership. Now, remember, there are two portions of the second discussion question. There's one that deals with situational leadership, and there's one that deals with self-leadership. So make sure that you address both of those issues, because they're both equally important but totally different. Okay, so that's discussion 2. And then the case study this week is really about the value of servant leadership. And when I say that, it's sort of like, why are we bothering to even study this? I mean, you look at it from an overall global perspective. What's really the application here? Why are we bothering to look at the elements, the different traits, and all of those things? Why have we segmented this into servant leadership versus leadership? So I really look forward to you really dissecting that a bit, to really get your thoughts and ideas on that as we go forward. So that is the lesson 6 preview. I'm going to be out of town as usual this coming week, but I'm not going to be out of the country this week. So totally accessible. So if you need me, make sure you give me a call. Also, just in the other review portion, I graded and made a lot of suggestions on your course projects from the prior week. So make sure you take a look at those, and make sure that you correct those, because again, the last week, lesson 7, when you submit part 3 of your course project, it's 20% of your grade. So it behooves you to make sure that you make the corrections and different things that I've suggested. So have a good week, and talk to you soon. Thanks.